For our notes tonight, we're going to be discussing the main topic of chapter 43, which is why did poverty persist in an age of affluence? Our previous chapter talked all about the different ways that the 1950s were a period of prosperity in the United States, and in many ways, and for many Americans, it was. All these advances in technology and medicine, and the economy was booming. For many Americans, it really was an age of affluence. But as we learn in the next chapter, there was a large chunk of Americans that did not enjoy this post-war prosperity. In fact, it gets the name The Other America from this book by a guy named Michael Harrington, who wrote this book that sort of exposed or shed light on the fact that 50 million Americans lived below the poverty line in 1959. That was 25% of the country. So you're looking at 1 out of every 4 Americans was considered below the poverty line. And that really shocked America's leaders and shocked a lot of average American citizens who were enjoying that prosperity because all they saw around them was prosperity. Michael Harrington uses the term socially invisible to describe why the poor weren't seen, and that in some ways they were sort of hiding in plain sight. For one, a lot of the poor lived in inner cities, or they lived out way away from the cities, away from the suburbs, right? Remember, the suburbs are growing. Middle-class white families are moving to the suburbs. They're not seeing the poor folks in the inner cities. They aren't seeing the poor folks out in rural areas. So that's one reason that the poor were often invisible. Another reason was many of the poor were children or were elderly. So the children would, go to school, come home. Elderly often didn't leave their homes or didn't leave the neighborhoods, so they aren't seen either. The poor didn't belong to influential organizations. They didn't have a political voice. They didn't have interest groups fighting for them, right? They didn't belong to political parties and run for political office, and so they didn't have anyone speaking up for them. So last thing we're going to look at is who were some of the people left out of the fabulous 50s, this period of prosperity. The book describes quite a few. We're going to hone in on some of them here in the notes. One big group was African Americans in inner city neighborhoods, primarily in the north, but throughout cities in the south as well, including Richmond. There just weren't enough jobs available in the cities to support these inner city communities. And the housing, like the shown in the picture here, was usually not particularly nice. It was usually pretty run down and dilapidated. Another group were black and white families in rural areas. This included groups like farmers, who had a hard time competing with big corporate farming companies. It also included coal miners in the Appalachian regions of Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia. And these were black and white families. And again, the jobs just weren't available. After the war ends, for coal miners, the demand for coal drops down, right? So the housing in these areas often was pretty poor, didn't have what we would deem a modern convenience, like indoor plumbing, for example. And so you see in the picture here, a family living in Appalachia. Lastly, Native Americans and Mexican Americans missed out in the prosperity of the 50s. Again, lived in rural areas, especially Native Americans out on reservations where there's just not jobs. Mexican Americans working, if they could get jobs, often weren't paid well for those jobs. And so these groups miss out as well. The book talks about some specific ways the government tried to address some of these issues, and sometimes actually did more harm than good. So make sure that you're using details from the book to help you with your assignments. But this set of notes gives you sort of a broad overview of this idea about why 25% of the country missed out on the age of affluence in the 1950s.